See Beneath Your Beautiful podcast is raw and intimate, sometimes funny, and always entertaining. With new episodes every Saturday, Hara explores our loves, fears, and hopes with a delicious combination of depth and lightness. Today we interview Harry J. Riley. Harry, will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I was born in South Carolina, came to Spokane when I was 20, started doing stand-up comedy about 5 years after that, and I've been doing it ever since.
How old are you now?
40.
I think I know you because I was a judge once in the Valley. What was that called? Do you know?
Valley Fest PG competition.
Well, I voted for you, just so you know, to win.
Thank you.
You were so funny. You cracked me up. You were heads above the rest, although I know some of the other people and they were very good. not that there was anything wrong with them. What was it like to move from the East Coast to the West Coast?
I thought it was going to be more of a culture shock than it actually was, because I grew up in a lower income area, and Spokane is I would say a middle class area. The only thing that I had to get used to was the weather. Everything else was, I also had to get used to living in a larger town because I wasn't used to like traffic and like not being able to just wander off into the woods, stuff like that.
I just assumed that it was a culture shock also in that it is so white here. That wasn't a problem for you at all?
Thinking back on it, I think it was, but because I'm more of an introvert, I tend to stay to myself anyway. I was just so like overwhelmed with, I'm on my own. I was in the military at the time, so I was trying to navigate all that. So I think that was such a shock to me that all the other stuff didn't seem that big.
Yeah. So you've been doing comedy for quite a while. Have you always been funny, or do you think so?
I think I've always been funny in one way or another. I think I was more funny with writing than any type of performance because I was so shy growing up that I never imagined getting on a stage in front of anybody. And anytime that I had to get on stage in front of anybody, I found a way to weasel out of it somehow. So I always channeled my humor through writing until the lady that I was married to at the time, her brother was a stand-up comic. And I was talking to him and his dad about a cat that we had. And I was talking about getting the cat off the counter and everything like that. And they were laughing. And they were like, man, you should do stand-up. And I was like, that's not going to happen. About a year or two later, everything just seemed to fall into place. And I gave it a try. And it just snowballed from there.
So how did you get past your, I don't know if it was stage fright or just introversion or insecurity? What was holding you back, do you think, in the beginning?
When I grew up, I could see these developments in me when I was young. I was a little more outgoing as a kid, and there was a stop at some point where I stopped being the let's try everything kid to the more reserved person, the more quiet and shy person. But what I was able to do was, instead of looking people in the eyes and conversing with people like one-on-one, I was just talking to the air and performing as if I was alone. And that really helped me conquer that. And that's what I usually tell people who have issues speaking in front of people. Sometimes just looking over their heads will help you calm your nerves and be able to perform like you would if no one was watching you. Mm-hmm. But that took a while. That was probably like 5 years worth of work to get to a point where I could walk on stage and not be a complete wreck.
It's funny. It's funny that we choose the path that causes us to be a complete wreck. You did go to college, right? And have a degree in
8 or 9 months after doing comedy, I went to Eastern Washington and I got my bachelor's in sociology.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that helps you with comedy at all?
Yeah, because with sociology, it's the study of how groups of people are intertwined and interact, and how a group of people can collectively think and act at the same time. So it helps me gauge an audience. If you go to a small town, you can pick up the newspaper or Google search recent events that happened in the area, like what this town might be feeling at that exact moment, what historically might be going on in that area. And that can help you stay away from topics or bring up certain things that they might find more funny. And so I think it did give me like a leg up from just a normal comedian who would go into any room and just start saying jokes. And then they say something that the entire audience is like, oh man, we don't talk about that because the church burned down last week.
Yeah. So were you just in a movie?
I just filmed a movie. It has I probably shouldn't even be saying this. It has the dumbest title. I'm like, if I saw that title, I would not rent that movie. I would not buy that movie. I wouldn't go to the theater. It's called A Good Enough Day. I played a mailman who the protagonist of the movie is trying to get to know, but I've known him, because your mailman sees you all the time. And this is the first time he's ever tried to talk to me. And we have an interaction where I'm like, why are you all of a sudden interested in my family and stuff? And I like the scene. I just don't like the title of the movie. I think they have to change that.
Did you have a speaking part?
Yeah. I mean, it was the entire chunk of a scene. I mean, after they cut it and everything, it might only be about 30 seconds, but it feels like about a 5 to 10 minute scene.
How long did it take to shoot a 5 to 10 minute scene?
About 5 hours.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
I filmed sketches and stuff like that, but because I'm just one guy sitting in a room and I could just move my camera here, I set this up, I could do it 3 times. I set it up another way, do it 3 times, stitch it all together. But with a movie, they had 3 cameras, they got a crew. And so like you'll film a scene where it's like, oh, this scene is going to be 5 seconds long, but it takes an hour to film it because now they got to move every camera and they got to change all the lighting. And now that the light's this way, you might need the makeup artist to come in. So I can see why it's such a difficult job to do. Mm-hmm. I would not do movies to dig ditches. I mean, I would rather do movies, but, because the work is way easier than manual labor, but it is a taxing experience.
Yeah, it is work.
Yeah, it is work. I think that because we see the finished product, we don't see like the months that it takes to film a movie and all the people that it takes to make the finished product. I think people do take it for granted.
Well, that's exciting. Is that your first movie you've ever done?
No, this is my second movie where I have a speaking role, but third movie overall.
How did you get this? Do you have a management company? What is that called?
It's called MAM, M-A-M. I don't feel like they're an agent like you see in movies where, oh, there's an agent that's on the phone is like, oh, I got this part for you. It'll be great. They will send you stuff that they think that you could do. And then you apply. And then at the end, the casting director will say, oh, let's audition them. But they're not like out there actively trying to find work for me. They're trying to find work for the agency as a whole. And they have a pool of people that they choose from. But I think that what works in my favor is that because I'm Black and I live in the Northwest, I get a lot of parts where they're looking for a little bit of spice in a scene or something. And I'll go to an audition and there'll be like 3 other Black guys that I've never seen them before. And I'm like, what? You don't live in Spokane. You must have you must have came in the town. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I know every Black person. That's ridiculous. But but I'm always like, wow, that's another Black actor. That's great. I came back from Oklahoma a couple weeks ago, and it was amazing because I live up here, and you start to get blind to what's around. Yeah, and when I went to Oklahoma, and I was doing shows down there, and there's like 40% of the audience is Black, and you're like, what? And then they come up and talk to you, and I'm like stammering and stuff. I didn't know it was that many people here, and they're like, "What are you talking about? This is this is this is Oklahoma. There's a bunch of different people here." I went to the Walmart there, and there was Hispanic people, Native people, white people, Black people, and I was like, I like this because when you go to a store here, there's an aisle that's like, oh, here's the Hispanic, here's the Asian food. But when I was going through that Walmart, it was like, oh, that's you just go to the rice section and you'll find whatever rice you're looking for. It's not an Asian section where you find your food, or here's the Mexican section with the tortillas and stuff. It's just like, no, that's over there by the breads. Don't just go over there. Yeah.
So what is your hope for yourself? What is your dream of your future?
I would love to get on like a television show or have a bigger movie part and kind of have that help my comedy, because I love comedy, but there's just something unique about filmmaking that seems like it fits me really well. They seem to like my ability to punch up the script that I've been given and make it a little more funnier for like actual people. I like doing that type of stuff. I would love to be on like a television show and do that. But comedy is such a fun career, but it's also like one of the hardest, not for like any danger or anything, like I wouldn't want to be a cop or a fireman or anything like that. But it's hard in that it's so hard to get to a level where you can actually turn your jokes into a livable income.
Right.
I think that can be said about any art, like photography, painters, cartoonists, like all these things that people, digest daily. It seems for some reason it's hard to make a decent living at it. I love it, but at the same time, the time to money ratio is much higher in movies and television than it is in comedy.
Are you making money with your photography, or are you doing that just for passion?
I make a little bit of money from it. I would probably say, not counting 2020, but like 2019, it was about 25% of my income. And I wasn't really branching out too much. I was only doing the things that I was very confident in doing.
Like what?
Like if someone asked me to do a wedding, I would say I would be a second shooter in a wedding, be a second shooter and take orders from somebody else. But I wouldn't just walk up to somebody's wedding and start snapping photos because I'm not confident with that. But if somebody wants me to take a headshot for them for their portfolio or something, I could do that all day. I can make that look really good. So
yeah,
that and like product photography are what I was making a good little chunk of money doing before 2020 came. Photography and comedy are both art forms. So that's the same way with comedy. For almost a decade, I would say to myself, if I'm funny enough, the people will come to me and I will get more shows. And that did not happen. I spent a decade making the same amount of money because I wasn't I wouldn't just tell people, hey, I'm a comedian. What I also didn't like to do is to say I'm good at something. I always felt like I was cursing it. But at some point, I feel like you got to say to yourself, I am good at this thing, so pay me to do it. And as soon as I started doing that, it changed. As soon as I started saying, well, I'm not going to do that unless you give me this, or I'm not going to do that unless you meet these requirements. I'm not saying I'm, doing $30,000 a night shows or anything like that, but you realize people are like, oh, I was wondering why you was doing this. When I was doing photography at first, I would tell people, oh, I'll take your photos for $25. And then people would be like, oh, why are you charging so little when the end product is really good? And it took me a year or two to be like, this is the norm for people who put out good work. So this is what I should be doing as well, instead of trying to downplay myself for some type of weird, humbling experience, which being humble doesn't pay bills and being humble doesn't help you lead a better life.
I totally get everything you're saying, because it took me the longest time to finally say I was a professional photographer. And also, I feel the same way about what I charge and don't charge. I'm so glad that you just really finally learn your value and say, this is what I'm worth.
Yeah. And now that's what I tell other people, comedians that are just starting out. I tell them, once you get to a certain point where you feel confident in your abilities, there's nothing wrong with saying you're a professional comedian, or nothing wrong with walking up to people and going, I could give you my services for this amount of money. And it took me a while. And the whole time, other people were doing it, but I just wasn't doing it until I did. And then it seemed like everybody was like, oh, you finally decide to get what you were worth. And I was like, oh, I didn't know until I did it.
What about like when you won comedy contests and stuff?
Yeah, but it was fleeting.
Mm-hmm.
I would win a competition and you would get all these accolades and people are like, oh, you're great. And then you would go to a bar in Montana and there's like 12 people and they got the TVs are on in the bar and nobody's listening.
Oh, no.
And then you just get brought back down to earth. And that used to really hurt. But this is just part of the job until you get to a point where people know you. Just going to have to sometimes do comedy with the TVs on and get them to see you and go, oh, this is actually entertaining. So I'm going to pay attention. I had to fight through that.
I have a girlfriend who talks about how when she was in radio here, Blake Shelton, when he was a nobody, came and she was trying to get people to go see him because she felt so bad for him. So I'm just saying we all start somewhere.
Yeah.
Even Blake Shelton didn't, he probably was performing with the TVs on also at some point in his career. So how old were you about when you feel like you became an introvert? Like about what age? Like your teens?
No, I was probably 7 or 8. I remember it because my first couple of years, like in school, I was let me answer these questions, let me interact with the teacher. And I think there's a couple things that probably happened. I had a really bad stutter that I developed around that age. And I had to go to speech therapy until about the 4th grade. Once kids focused on that and was like, oh, you stutter, you're a weirdo. I think that kind of, and once you get to a certain age, you're kind of like, oh, this is how I protect myself.
Yeah.
So I think that's what happened. Being in the military kind of helped because you had to speak up and you had to take initiative. So I think the stepping stones were having a good speech therapist that helped me get rid of my stutter. Then being in the military where I felt comfortable stepping forward, and that kind of helped me when it came time to get on stage. I was able to do it and not just be frozen in a moment. Because I feel like so many people want to do certain things, but they get frozen. And while they're still there trying to make that decision, time just keeps going on and on and on. And then when they look up and they're like, all right, I'm finally ready, they're like 70 and they're like, oh man, I wasted a lot of time just trying to make the decision to get to do something.
That's so great. I'm so glad you said that. Is there like a common denominator or something do you think that you bring to it, or a certain kind of crowd that makes it not a good night versus a good night? Or is it just sometimes you're on and sometimes you're off? Like I have good days and bad days in general.
90% of the time, it's the comedian on stage. Sometimes they're having a bad day, and so they're not giving their best performance, or they're tired, or something that has to do with the comedian where their performance is off a little bit. And then 5% of that is, say you're doing a show in a bar and nobody told the people in the bar that there was going to be a show. They just turn off all the TVs, and then somebody just grabs a mic and goes, all right, everybody ready for comedy night? That can go bad. Or if they're like already intoxicated, like really intoxicated. And the other 5% is just dumb, bad luck. Sometimes everybody is not synced up for a comedy show. And because it's a live performance, you can feed off of the audience, or the audience can feed off you. I've seen people get up and get really aggressive and mean at the very start, and then the crowd turns on them, and it's a terrible show.
It must feel so personal. You're standing out there and it's you on stage.
I used to take it very personal. Well, you know what? I still do, because when I write a joke, there's a little bit of me, even if it's something that is totally made up, it's still a little bit of me. Like if somebody didn't like a short story I wrote, I would still feel very bad. The only difference I feel is that because you're right there while they're consuming your art, they're telling you in real time that they do not like what you're creating right then. And that, I think that it can hurt sometimes.
Yeah, I imagine. You have a daughter, right?
Yep, she's 18 now.
Oh, she's 18.
Yeah.
Does she have any interest in comedy?
Nope.
Are you glad?
Yeah, because it's such a hard business to get through, and it's very hard for women.
What's your daughter into?
Fashion. That's what she's going to school for. She's going to the Academy of Arts University in San Francisco.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I'm proud of her.
Do you have any words of advice for her that you've learned over the years that you know now for yourself at 40?
I tell her to take her education seriously. Don't get into debt. That's probably the biggest one. Don't get into debt.
Good advice.
Yeah. I could do comedy because I don't have a whole bunch of bills where I have to work somewhere else to keep money flowing in every time. Like I could go a couple weeks without having an income coming in. And I want that for her.
Do you think your third grade self would be amazed that you were in a movie?
Yes. He would be, he'll be like, how did you do that? Because I had such low self-esteem. I had such low confidence in myself. I remember growing up, I used to always like you would see people getting in relationships and stuff as a teenager. And I would just lay there going, oh, please let me wake up and have everybody find me attractive, or so I could be, a cooler person and do all these things that I want to do. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s where I was like, this is me. I can only change so much. Like I can lose some weight. I can brush my hair, brush my teeth. But other than that, This is just who I am. And as soon as I got comfortable with it, I don't think anything changed, but I felt better in my day to day. I just felt comfortable, and that kind of drew people toward you.
Queen Latifah says that confidence is sexy. You don't have to look a certain way or be a certain size. You just have to be secure in your own self, and then you attract who you're supposed to attract.
Yeah.
Confidence makes you beautiful.
I see a change. Like when I look in the mirror now, I go, all right, you're looking all right.
Awesome.
Let's go out into the world. But when I was growing up, I was like, oh, just look at you. Look at your head. Look at your nose. I always found a flaw. But now I look at it and like, that's my nose. Those are my lips. All right. Looking all right. Let's go.
God created you and you're perfect. That's what I think.
I do have a regret in that I didn't discover that earlier in my life.
I think some people never get there. So I'm so glad that at 30, you figured it out. You could have spent a whole life hating something stupid like your nose because it's just a nose.
Just hearing it and thinking about it is the saddest thing I can imagine, is not being comfortable with yourself and loving who you are. And there's nothing wrong with stuff like, oh, I want to get rid of my stomach or, be a little bit better. But being comfortable with yourself I feel like is more important than all of that.
I think so too.
Like I know somebody who grew up bigger. That's just how they were built. And they didn't like themselves and they started taking drugs and they got addicted to drugs and they lost a lot of weight, but their life was ruined. Everything got taken from them. They were living out on the street. Their kid got taken away from them. And that's like the dangerous side of not loving yourself and not feeling comfortable with yourself.
It's really my passion is for people not to waste a moment not loving themselves. Oh my gosh, this has been the best conversation. Thank you so much for being on my podcast, See Beneath Your Beautiful.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. Okay, cool. And I'll use your photo that I took of you. Is that okay?
I was looking at the photo because somebody wanted to put it on a poster and I was looking at it and somebody walked by and was like, who took that photo? That's amazing. Just look at it. And I was like, yeah, it's Harold Allison. And they were like, wow, if I need to get my photos taken, that's where I'm going. And then I was like, oh, but I didn't want to give you business and then immediately take it away. That was
That's awesome. Thanks for telling me that story. Really, thank you so much. This was really fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was fun.